guys, today we're going to be discussing the fantastic world of fungi and where you can find them from the University of Kentucky Forest Health Extension Lab. So what exactly is a mushroom anyway? We may think of mushrooms and fungi as these quintessential toadstools that just pop out of the ground in your lawn or maybe have little gnomes sitting on top of or underneath them. But that's not all that mushrooms and that fungi are, and we're going to discuss some of those nuanced differences between what a mushroom is, what a fungus is, how they're the same and how they're different. So the kingdom fungi, mushrooms and fungi, mushrooms are actually their own kingdom. They're separate from plants. Very often people think that fungi and plants all belong to the same kingdom, but they're actually very diverse lineages, and in some ways, the kingdom fungi actually has more in common with animals than they do with plants. So even though you'll often see plants and fungi lumped together, they're actually wildly different to the point where they are separate kingdoms from each other. Fungi are nature's cleaning crew. The majority of macrofungi, and macrofungi are things that have a mushroom fruiting body that you can see. So what we think of when we think of mushrooms and fungus, but they're macrofungi, they're macroscopic. We can see them without the use of a microscope. The majority of these macrofungi are going to be saprophytes, and that means that they feed on dead and decaying material. If it wasn't for things like bacteria and saprophytic fungi and amoebas, all these cool little microbial organisms, we would be sitting around in like huge piles of dead and decaying material, plants and animals and all kinds of things, because it's these organisms that help break down all of that dead material, that detritus, and provide rich topsoil and nutrients, as well as just to keep our environments cleaner and healthier. So a lot of these saprophytic fungi, they are this cleaning crew that we have here in nature. But fungi can also be some of our most terrifying parasites. Not all fungi are saprophytes. They don't all feed on dead material. Some of them are parasitic, and parasitic means that you need a living host. You can't eat dead things. You need a living organism to feed off of, whether that organism is a plant, like in the upper left-hand corner, that's a cedar apple rust fungus. It's feeding on that cedar tree that it's growing on. Or maybe you are an animal pathogen that feeds on dead skin cells, like the ringworm on the horse in the upper right-hand corner. And then there's a whole host of other parasitic fungi that have some pretty creepy ways of parasitizing their hosts, like the cordyceps in the bottom two photos. Maybe you've heard of these guys before. They're pretty wild. If you haven't, I suggest you check out some of the really interesting documentaries out there on cordyceps fungi. But they hijack their host's nervous system to promote their own spread and reproduction. They're pretty wild. But, fungi can be super creepy, but they are also really amazing. Fungi do so many incredible things for us, aside from the fact that they help clean up the environment and help break down decaying material. Fungi are also responsible for a lot of beers that you drink, for the delicious cheese and bread that you might enjoy eating, and also for medications that have really revolutionized the way that we can approach human health and have helped to prevent infections. Things like penicillium that are based on fungi are absolutely crucial to how we approach human health and fight infection today. So what exactly is a fungus? What is a mushroom? What is a fungus? How are they the same and how are they different? Well, think of mycelium, which we'll talk about more in a minute, what exactly mycelium is. But think of the mycelium as being the body of the fungus. Imagine an apple tree, and the tree is the main body of the organism. It's what produces the fruits and seeds that allow that organism to reproduce. Well, in much the same way, fungi have mycelium. Now, we don't usually see mycelium. It's usually growing inside the whatever substrate that fungus is feeding on, so often inside a log or under the leaf litter, wherever that mushroom might be growing. And that is like the tree of of the fungus. Then you have the fruit. In an apple tree, the fruit is obviously an apple. And the fruit is the method, the vehicle by which that organism, the apple tree, spreads its seeds to reproduce. But fungi, their fruit is what we know as a mushroom. For macrofungi that we can see, they have that fruiting body, that mushroom, that is how they spread their seeds, as it were. Spores, which are like seeds because they're the way that fungi reproduce and spread themselves around, but they are in actuality different. They're not truly seeds. But it's the same kind of concept. The apple tree produces apple fruit, which has the seeds that the tree uses to spread itself around and reproduce. In a similar way, fungi have mycelium, which is the body of the organism that produces their fruit, the mushrooms, that spread the spores that help the fungi to reproduce. So generally, one of the first things that people want to know is, well, how do I identify mushrooms, and how do I know which ones are safe for me to eat? Well, we're going to tackle part of that today, and we'll be talking about the basics of mushroom ID. Like, what do you need to know if you want to go out and identify mushrooms in the woods? How do you look at a mushroom in different aspects to understand what you need to know to make a successful ID? Because identifying mushrooms can be kind of tricky. One of the first things that you want to look at when you're trying to successfully identify a mushroom is you want to ask yourself, where is this mushroom growing? Is it possibly growing under or near a certain type of tree? There are a lot of mushrooms that are something called mycorrhizal. And mycorrhizal means that they live in a symbiotic relationship with the roots of certain species of trees. So often when you are looking at mushrooms for ID, you might want to look up and see what kind of trees are growing overhead. If it's oak trees or pine trees, that can maybe tell you something about what species or a group of mushrooms you might be looking at. So, looking up, seeing what kind of trees are growing there can sometimes be helpful in the ID process. You also want to see if maybe the mushroom is growing on a tree. Is it a living tree or a dead tree? Because some mushrooms are, as we talked about, saprophytes. They grow on dead and decaying material. And then there are mushrooms that are parasites on living trees. And there are some that do both. That can be parasitic or saprophytic. Or you could be looking at a mushroom that is growing on a living tree, but maybe in a pocket of dead wood within that living tree. It can get a little complicated. But just observing what species of tree that mushroom might be growing on and whether that tree is living or dead can be helpful in the ID process. Or maybe your mushroom is growing on or out of the grass or dirt. Often these mushrooms are saprophytes. They are feeding on detritus in the soil, and they might look like they're growing straight up out of the ground. And that can be an ID key as well. Now, with these mushrooms, I really encourage you to be a little bit cautious, because just because a mushroom looks like it's growing on the grass or dirt doesn't mean that it necessarily is, and you might want to do a little bit of investigating and excavate around the base of that mushroom. You might find that that mushroom is actually growing on a piece of wood that's buried underneath the surface of the soil. So just because it looks like it's growing on the grass or dirt doesn't mean that it always is. There could be a piece of wood or something buried there, or a tree root that mushroom is actually growing out of. So sometimes a little bit of investigating is necessary. So we're going to go through the anatomy of a mushroom. Mushroom ID 101. And we'll start at the bottom and work our way up. We already talked about mycelium a little bit. Mycelium is, as we said, the body of the fungus. Think of like that apple tree. The mycelium is the tree. It's the main body of the organism. Mycelium is a network of strands and cells that gathers water and nutrients for the fungus and helps extend the network of that organism. It is the main body of the organism, but it doesn't really look like what we think of as being a single organism. Rather, it's all these strands that spread out to pull nutrients into the fungus and promote its growth and spread. Now, once in a while, you'll hear people say that you can identify fungi based on their mycelium, and you can if you're working in a lab with genetics extracting DNA, and looking at species ID that way. But from a purely macroscopic standpoint, you just looking at mycelium visually, you can't identify a fungus to species just based on the mycelium alone. You need a microscope, and even then, you're not going to be able to know very much just from looking at the mycelium. To use the mycelium for ID, you're looking at genetic work, and that's about it. The largest organism on Earth is thought to be a fungus. The humongous fungus, which you might have heard of, growing out in Oregon, is a giant armillaria mushroom that is this fungal network that spreads through all of these acres of land, and it's that fungal network, that mycelial network, that is the body of that organism, and is all one single organism that is thought to be the largest on Earth. Next up, you have the base or bulb of the mushroom, and this is an important ID character to look at. So a base or bulb is this egg shape at the base of a mushroom that some families or genera of mushrooms are much more likely to have than others. And this is a super important ID characteristic, which we'll talk about more in just a moment, because not all mushrooms that have a base or bulb are lethally toxic, but a lot of the most toxic mushrooms that we have in North America, not all of them, but a lot of them, are going to have this base or bulb because it's a hallmark of the Amanita group of mushrooms. And the Amanita have members like the Destroying Angel and the Death Cap, which are deadly toxic mushrooms. So while not all mushrooms that have this feature are going to be deadly toxic, and while not all deadly toxic mushrooms have this base or bulb, quite a few will. So it's a very, very important feature to look for when you're identifying fungi. And sometimes to see that base or bulb, you're going to have to do a little bit of excavation around the base of the mushroom. Push back that topsoil, the leaf litter, and really take a close look and see, is there a base or bulb there? Or is the mushroom just growing straight up out of the soil without that egg there at the base? Sometimes people will call it an egg as well. I can't stress enough how important it is to look for this feature on mushrooms and ensure whether or not it's present, because it could be very important for your health and well-being. Next up, we have a universal veil. The universal veil is part of that egg, that base or bulb on a mushroom. When those mushrooms that have that feature start out growing underground, they're in this egg-like structure, and as they grow and mature, they push out through the top, and that universal veil is broken, leaving that cup, that vulva at the base, and often leaving veil remnants on the cap of the mushroom. And this can take on a number of different forms. There's a universal veil or a partial veil, depending on the species of mushroom that might be left. And it can be very ornamented. It can leave little fragments on the cap of the mushroom. But understanding what species you're looking at and whether or not it's supposed to have a universal veil or partial veil, or how those remnants look on the cap of the mushroom, can be very important for ID. Because some fungi may have a universal veil, a partial veil, or both at the same time. And like those Amanita mushrooms that we already talked about, usually have both a partial veil as well as a universal veil, which we'll talk about more in a second. And when you're trying to ID fungi, always look at different life stages of the mushroom before making an ID determination. Because some of these features, like this annulus, which is a remnant of that veil, or little scale fragments on top of the mushroom, they might not remain. They might be worn off by wind or rain, or by insects or other animals chewing on the mushroom. So seeing different stages of development can be very, very important for ID to ensure whether or not these traits are present at different points in the mushroom's growth. So sometimes partial veil remnants can look very different depending upon the genus of mushrooms that you're looking at. In the Stropharia, they tend to hang down in strips around the edge of the cap, whereas in like the Lacrimaria, they can look more like spider webs. They can be these little spider webby type remnants around the cap of the mushroom. Cortinarius mushrooms do this as well. They tend to have this cortina or spiderwebby veil remnants that are found around the edge of the cap, which are very, very diagnostic for these genera of fungi. Next, you have the stem or stipe of a mushroom, and these words can be used interchangeably here. But the stem or stipe, that's the stalk of the mushroom, this can be a diagnostic feature as well in a number of different ways. You want to see if the stipe has a color to it. Very often, the stipe of a mushroom will be white, but there's a wide range of other colors that can be present as well. You want to ask yourself, is this stipe textured in any way? The genus Russula is very well known for having stipes that tend to snap very readily like chalk when you break them. And that's actually a diagnostic character for that group of fungi, is they're very chalky textured stipes that snap very easily. Or maybe there's reticulation on the stipe. A lot of the boletes and their relatives will sometimes have reticulation or patterning on the stem of the mushroom. They can be highly diagnostic as well. The ring that we already talked a little bit about, that annulus, is a very important diagnostic feature. Now, not all mushrooms that have an annulus or ring are going to have that base or bulb, so don't think that those two things always go together. But an annulus is a very diagnostic feature for fungi, but as we talked about, be sure that you're looking at mushrooms in different stages of development, if at all possible, because that annulus or ring can be very easily worn away by the elements or eaten by insects. But a lot of genera of fungi are going to have this annulus, and it can take on a number of different forms. Some, like the macrolepiodas, have a very, very tiny, thin, fragile annulus that most of the time you probably won't even see unless you catch a specimen at the right stage because it's so small and delicate. Whereas, like the amanitas and some of the larger agaricus mushrooms are going to have a pretty chunky annulus. Gills, pores, or spines. What exactly is going on here? Toothed fungi are exactly what they sound like. They are fungi that tend to have teeth on the undersurface of their fruiting body rather than pores or gills, which you might see more commonly. And a number of fungi do have these teeth. They're like little icicles that hang out under the cap. Lion's manes, hedgehog mushrooms, jelly-toothed fungi, as the name might suggest, all have these tooth-like structures, and that's where the spores are going to be found. They're going to be clinging to the sides of those teeth, and they'll float away as the mushroom reaches maturity and is ready to disperse its spores. Pores might be something that you've seen a little bit more commonly. Fungi with pores are often bolete fungi, although they are by far not the only fungi to have pores. A lot of fungi that fruit on wood tend to be fungi with pores as well. And in fact, these fungi are often called polypore fungi due to the large number of pores that they have where their spores are born. And the spores are going to be up inside those pores or tubes. And again, as that fruiting body matures, those tubes will release those spores and they'll drift off in the breeze to make more mushrooms. But there are a wide variety of fungi that do tend to have these pore structures. Ganoderma fungi have them as well. A lot of different fungi, and those pores can take on a wide variety of shapes, of textures, of colors. So understanding not just that a mushroom has pores, but also what those pores look like, what color they are, can be very important from a diagnostic standpoint as well. And finally, you have gilled fungi. This might be what you most commonly think of when you think of mushrooms or fungi that have gills, but these gills can take on a wide variety of forms. Again, the gills are where the spores of the fungi are found. The spores mature along those gills, and once that fruiting body has reached maturity, once the mushroom is mature, those spores will be released from the gills. But understanding what the gills look like, what color they are, how closely they're spaced or how far apart, if they have wavy edges, if there's any kind of branching or forking in the gills. These can all be very important diagnostic features. Maybe there's There's staining that occurs when you crush the gills. Some mushrooms have chemical reactions that take place that mean a rather rapid color change might occur, or when those gills are crushed or broken. Or maybe you're looking at a lactarius mushroom that's going to have that latex oozing out of the gills when you snap them. These are all features to look for. And you also want to check out how those gills attach to the stipe. Remember that central stem? You want to look at how the gills attach to the stipe of the mushroom. Do the gills meet the stipe? Do they run down the stipe? This is what you'll see in oyster mushrooms and a lot of lactarius fungi, these decurrent gills that run down the stipe. Maybe they don't even meet the stipe at all. They might be free gills that don't actually attach to the stipe of the mushroom. Understanding how those gills attach to the stipe can actually be a highly diagnostic feature that you might want to be sure to take a look at. And even the margin of a mushroom. We've already talked about this a little bit in the form of that partial veil and looking to see if it leaves little veil remnants around the edge of the cap. But understanding how the margin of a mushroom looks can be diagnostic as well. A lot of the boletes tend to have that straight or kind of curled edge to them, whereas some have a recurved edge that kind of swoops up at the edges, or maybe that rolls underneath, or is enrolled or involuted. This is all important features to look for. You know, when you're trying to identify a mushroom, one of the best things that you can do is take a lot of good photos because you might not be able to identify it in the field. So, taking really good photos, not just of the color of the mushroom, but looking at the gills and the margin and the stem, this can all be really important for identifying your mushroom successfully, either in the field or later on back at home with your ID books. And finally, you have the cap of the mushroom. This is sometimes called the pileus as well. You know, when people are being pretty fancy, it'll be like, oh yeah, the pileus of the mushroom. But you can just call it a cap. It's fine. Um, but this cap of the mushroom is a diagnostic feature as well. And there's a lot of different shapes and textures that caps can take on. Texture can be super important in mushroom ID. We've already talked about this a little bit. Maybe the cap is really hairy. There's a number of mushrooms that tend to have almost hairy or fuzzy caps. Maybe they're a lactarius mushroom that secretes latex when you cut those gills or break the cap in any way. Or they have a brittle texture to them like russulas. Maybe they're a hygroscope or related mushroom that tends to have a very slimy, mucousy cap. There are some fungi that have this very viscid, slimy cap to them that can be very highly diagnostic. Texture can be incredibly helpful when it comes to mushroom ID. Is the cap tacky? Is it completely dry? Use your senses when you're trying to identify fungi. See how things smell. Does it have maybe an anise scent to it, or maybe it smells like some kind of cucumbers or vegetables of some sort? Fungi can have all kinds of odd smells. Really employ all of your senses, with maybe the exception of taste, when you're trying to identify mushrooms to learn as much as you can about the mushroom that you're looking at. Texture, you know, as we said, is really important. Things like Caprinus that tend to have this kind of shaggy appearance to them, or this little Strombilomyces, this old man of the woods. He tends to have all these little like bumps on the cap. They're not actually a part of like a universal veil. They're just little ornamentations on the cap. But again, it's texture that can be very, very helpful when you're identifying mushrooms. And finally, you have the spores of the mushroom. These spores are how the mushroom reproduces. We've already talked about this a little bit. They're like seeds. They're how mushrooms move around. So the spore color, the size, the shape, and the location of those spores can all be very important diagnostic features in mushroom ID. Um, but you need a microscope and some slides to be able to take a close look at those spores. And even then, you're probably not going to be able to tell the species from the spore alone, but often those spores are helpful in ID, and you'll see when people get really, really into mushroom ID that they'll start talking about, you know, measuring how large the spores are and the kind of ornamentations that might be on the spores. But, you know, that's not something you necessarily have to worry about right away. However, even if you don't have a microscope, spores can still be helpful to some extent in narrowing down your ID, and that's through the form of spore prints. A spore print allows you to take a look at the color of the spores that a mushroom might have. So being able to take a spore print is sometimes really helpful, and you might actually see that in some ID manuals on fungi. Is they'll ask you, oh, well, was the spore print white? Was it dusty pink color or brown? What color were those spores? Different shapes of fungi. We already talked about this a little bit. The spores come from different places, like the pored fungi and the gilled fungi. But no matter what shape fungi take on, they are going to have those spores because that's what the mushroom is doing. Is it's there to spread the spores, to spread the reproductive structures of the fungus. And the spores are born along those pores or gills or teeth of the mushroom. And you can see here in this shot where you have a gill of a mushroom and then these tiny little spores that are born all along the sides of it. Spores are pretty cool if you're a bit of a mushroom nerd. Gastromycetes and sap fungi, they do things a little bit differently than the fungi that we've talked about that have a very distinctive cap. Gastro literally meaning stomach, so stomach fungi. These fungi keep all of their spores inside of, of the fruiting body like a stomach would be. And these fungi can take on a variety of forms. They don't all have that true stomach look of like a puffball. They can be more like a cup or an urn shaped. They might be these little earth star fungi that you see in the bottom right, but these are all gastromycetes where they don't have gills or pores or teeth, but they store their spores usually internally. And the way that this usually works is once that fruiting body is mature and those spores have matured, the fruiting body will dry out, and either through rain droplets hitting the fruiting body or animals or people stepping on them, that fruiting body will be broken open and those spores can be released and float off into the air. And that's how gastromycetes reproduce without gills or pores or anything like that. There's also club fungi. Club fungi are not going to have gills or pores either. They don't even have that internal spore formation that gastromycetes do. Club fungi, they decided to keep things simple, and they just have their spores directly on these branching structures of their fruiting body. So no fancy gills or ornamentation, just spores directly on those branching structures of the fungus itself. And then you have stinkhorns. And stinkhorns they decided to be kind of funky when the day that mushrooms were trying to figure out how they wanted to spread their spores around. The stinkhorns were like, we want to be different. So they came up with something kind of wild and crazy, which is they tend to have this very stinky, slimy matrix called a gleba that all of their spores are found in. And this gleba, as I said, it smells really atrocious, and the point of that is to draw in carrion insects, things like flies and beetles that smell this and literally think that something is rotting or dying. And they're attracted to that gleba. They tend to get it all over themselves as they're trying to figure out where the dead, rotting animal is. And then when they fly off and leave, they take those spores in that gleba with them to spread the fungi around. So stinkhorns can be kind of offensive to our tastes in a number of different ways beyond just how they smell, but they have a pretty cool workaround to how to spread themselves around and reproduce in the form of the spores in that sticky gleba matrix that just smells absolutely atrocious. When I was in grad school, there was this patch of these that I would walk by in the summer that would always fruit out of these wood chips. These guys are usually saprophytes, so they usually fruit on decaying wood substrate. And there was this one area that these stinkhorns would fruit in just mass every summer, and you'd walk by in the dead of summer in the heat, and it would smell like a rotting pile of trash. These things were such a strong, overpowering smell that you couldn't miss them. Even if you didn't know what was causing the smell, you would definitely sense their presence. Not all fungi that have a large fruiting body are basidiomycetes, which are what we have talked about up until this point. And basidiomycetes are called that because they have basidiospores. It's the kind of spores that they have. But there are also some fungi, Ascomycetes, that make up the large majority of fungi in existence that are generally microscopic. Most molds that we think of, and honestly most pathogens as well, are Ascomycetes, and that's because they have ascospores. That's why they're called Ascomycetes. But there are a few Ascomycetes that are macroscopic as well. Probably one of the most famous is going to be the morel mushrooms. These are actually Ascomycetes, not basidiomycetes. So they have ascospores that are borne on their fruiting body, but also the little bird's nest fungi, the jelly ear fungi in the bottom right. These are all ascomycete fungi that still have this macroscopic fruiting body. Mushrooms play a lot of different roles in the ecology of environments. They can be positive, they can be negative, but the role of mushrooms in the ecology of most environments can't be understated. So we'll start out by talking about some of the good, and that would be something like mycorrhizae. We've already discussed mycorrhizal fungi a little bit. These are fungi that live in a kind of symbiotic association with the roots of plants. And this is usually a good thing for both the fungus and the plant. The fungus gets carbohydrates and nutrients from the plant, and in turn, it helps kind of extend the plant's reach, as it were, to be able to absorb more water and nutrients into the plant itself. So, this is a mutualistic, symbiotic relationship. And mycorrhizae, we're finding more and more, can have a lot of positive impacts on plant health and can be super important for helping plants thrive and do well. These are examples of like little mycorrhizal colonies inside the cells of plants, even. So it's not always like a fruiting body like you would think of. A lot of mycorrhizal fungi exist within the plant itself, just as hyphal or mycelial masses. And as we've talked about, fungi are really important for nutrient cycling. They're the decomposers, the cleaning crew of nature, and they help break everything down and help energy be recycled through the ecosystem. There are also some things that fungi do that aren't so positive, at least from a human perspective, and this can be in the form of plant pathogens. We won't talk about human pathogens today because those are just super creepy. We'll stick with plant pathogens. But things like dogwood spot anthracnose or cedar apple rust, uh, some really awful things like laurel wilt, the Raphaelia loricula pathogen. These are all fungal pathogens, so they infect the plant tissue. Sometimes they're just cosmetic in nature, like with this dogwood spot anthracnose. Usually not a big deal for the host plant, it might just look a little bit unsightly. But when you consider things like laurel wilt, Raphaelia loricula, that can be absolutely lethal to the tree, and it will kill it in most aspects. Also, things like Cryphonectria parasitica. This is chestnut blight. So, if you've ever, heard of American chestnut trees that at one time dominated forests of the eastern United States, it's this little innocuous fungus that produces these little orange pustules on the bark of the tree that wiped out the American chestnut. So, the impacts of pathogenic fungi on our forests and on our ecosystems can't be understated. They've absolutely decimated some of our most iconic tree species when they're non-native fungi that are introduced into the environment. American chestnut is a prime example of that. These trees once used to be all over the forests of the eastern U.S., and now they only exist mostly in the understory as small seedlings because this fungus was able to completely wipe them out. And then we have the downright creepy of fungi. And these are things like cordyceps, which we talked about a little bit at the beginning. They're parasitic fungi. They parasitize usually an insect host. So far, we don't know of any cordyceps that parasitize people, so that's a good thing. That's the stuff that horror movies are made of. But cordyceps, they only parasitize insects. But when they do, it's pretty wild. They'll hijack the nervous system of their host and induce that insect to behave in a certain way that actually aids the fungus in spreading and reproducing. So pretty wild stuff. They can take on a wide variety of shapes and structures that cordyceps fungi can take on depending upon the species of cordyceps and the host that it's growing on. Like these poor little moths and ladybugs and this very, very upset tarantula that has been completely overgrown by cordyceps fungi. So thank you all for joining us today as we discussed the fantastic world of fungi and where and how you can find them. I hope that you'll check out some of the other mycology and forest health related videos on our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching!